got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart, down in my heart, down in my heart. I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart, down in my heart to stay. I sang that song often as a child. I'm pretty sure that I learned it in Vacation Bible School, and I remember that we sang it at church, usually as a call and response, though, like, I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart. You get the idea. I loved the music and the simplicity of the melody and how it seemed to match the cheerfulness, the joy of the lyrics. And lyrics were always what I was drawn to as a little girl. And I remember thinking about those lyrics. I do have joy in my heart. I remember my summer days filled with laughter and shouts of glee as my cousins and siblings and I ran around the woods, playing games and climbing trees. I remember the first time I climbed as high as I could and got to the highest branch I'd ever been to. And the view I saw was one I had never seen before. I literally burst into song as the joy of the moment overflowed in me. I remember the deep, quiet joy I felt when my grandmother and I would go for rambling walks and she would hold my hand and I would breathe in the moment and feel such a connection to her and everything around us. I remember the innocent joy I felt each time I got a new book put in my hands. And when we moved to Milwaukee and I walked into the Central Library for the very first time, I remember being awestruck and speechless with the joy of the moment, by the beauty of the space and the sheer magnitude of the books available. The joy in that moment, in all of these moments, is still with me. And when I think about it, that in and of itself is a miracle. And I have been thinking about it, joy, for this whole year. Since early January, when a very wise person, who may possibly be the senior minister of this congregation, asked me, when I was telling her my doubts and fears about taking my life in new directions, a not so simple question. Do you think you don't deserve joy? I was stunned by the question and by the realization that apparently no, I don't think I deserve joy. That, like most people, I'm afraid of joy, of its promise and possibilities. That, like so many people, I'm so fearful of joy being snatched away that I guard myself against it. So those realizations sent me on a path of unraveling why I think that, and asking what is joy and how can I reconnect to it and why does it even matter? So I stand before you not as an expert on joy, but as a person who struggled to write this sermon because I felt joy was a bit elusive lately. But over the weeks and the months that I've been pulling on all these threads, I've come to remember those moments of joy from my childhood, to remember how joy down in my heart felt. But I began to wonder, is that happiness or joy? And what is the difference between happiness and joy? I know that I'm a pretty baseline happy person and have been since infancy, apparently. And despite my own struggles with anxiety, I've always been fairly happy and positive, which actually is not surprising when you look at the research into happiness, which says that most of us have a set point of happiness that's actually genetically determined. But despite that, people can do things to increase their happiness, no matter what the set point is. Things like stay active in our communities, connect with others in meaningful ways, focus on experiences rather than things, exercise. Happiness, researchers say, is a vital part of human existence, and it's important enough to be encoded in the Declaration of Independence and written about by such luminaries as the Dalai Lama. But since my quest has been to understand the differences between joy and happiness, I started looking for what people said about that. And wouldn't you know it, the very week that this sermon got accepted for this summer, David Brooks had an editorial in the New York Times where he was asking that very question, the difference between happiness and joy. And here is what he said. Happiness usually involves a victory for self. Joy tends to involve transcendence of self. Happiness comes from accomplishments. Joy comes when your heart is in another. I really liked that. I also started looking for what theologians have said about happiness and joy. And the Yale Center for Faith and Culture has an ongoing project that they started in 2014 on the theology of joy and the good life. They describe joy as fundamental to human existence and well-being. And in a videotaped interview with theologians you can find on their website, they asked people to reflect on joy and happiness. While the responses varied, a running theme in the theology is this: joy is a state of happiness transmuted by the presence of God, or the divine, or the universe, or whatever name you want to give to that which is greater than ourselves. Our level of happiness is many times determined by our circumstances and is often externally triggered. But joy, writes Peggy Clark, is determined by our responses to the circumstances and not the circumstances themselves. So while we may have a set point for happiness, feeling happy is changeable emotion, whereas joy is more consistent and deeper than happiness. And joy can be experienced even when we aren't feeling happy. I've come to define the difference between joy and happiness as this: our capacity for happiness is inborn, can develop over time, varies with our experiences, and is centered on self. Joy is a transcended kind of happiness, happiness that has grown beyond its own borders, that takes us deeply into and at the same time out of ourselves. Joy necessarily involves connection to others, to nature, to beauty, to the divine. And those connections can be cultivated. British blogger Rachel Fernley, writing for the blog Psychologies, shares 3 mindfulness practices to cultivate more joy in our lives. She says we should quiet our minds, really look at and see the world, and list our gratitudes. These practices, she suggests, help us to be fully present in each moment. And that kind of presence is necessary for joy. When I recall those moments from my childhood, singing songs in trees, holding my grandmother's hand, having my breath taken away by books, what all of these memories have in common is my full attention in each moment I was in. And there have been other mindfully present experiences of joy since then. My wedding day, running down the aisle alone to meet my husband, I was so filled with joy that I laughed through the entire ceremony. The birth of my nephew Mannix 11 years ago, while I joke that childbirth is the inspiration of all science fiction ever imagined, the truth is that when I saw my nephew for the first time, I was overfilled with joy and love for my connection to him and to his mother, my sister. Yearly college graduations. Every year, I have the privilege through my work of watching amazing women graduate from college and knowing the difficult road so many have walked to get there. I shed tears of joy for their successes. The number of times I have been filled with joy by music in my car, at a concert in the park, in this room are uncountable. I know when I think about it that joy has been an underground spring flowing into me time after time. And that wellspring of joy is always present for all of us in times both momentous and mundane. We just don't always pay attention to it because we're too busy, because we have too much on our minds, we're too weighed down by our responsibilities and burdens. But if, like me, you've been living your life as if you don't have time for joy, as if you don't deserve joy, and if, like me, you can clearly remember experiences of joy, and you want to experience joy again more deeply and begin to believe that you deserve it, then join me in more mindful practices. Let us look and see the tightly furled buds on the bare bushes in spring, and the tender shoots of daffodil peeking through the earth, and let ourselves feel the joy inherent in their promise. Let us look and see and smell and taste the ripe fruits of summer, savoring each bite, and know the joy of the rain and the sun and the labor that brought that fruit to our plates. Let us look and see the tender veins of the oak leaf turned bright yellow as it drifts on the autumn breezes, and experience the joy of the transformation of life. Let us look and see the beauty of snowflakes swirling. Yes, even in a Midwest winter, let's put aside thoughts of the shoveling and just marvel at the miracle of the moment we're in. Let's listen to our children's rambling stories. Let's make our meals last twice as long. Let's put down our electronic devices for just a few minutes and really look at the people we love as if we're seeing them for the first time. This mindfulness is how we cultivate joy. By being present in the world now, by remembering, as Mary Oliver wrote in her poem Wild Geese, which I think is probably a favorite of many in this room, that the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you over and over, announces your place in the family of things. If joy indeed transcends self, is indeed cultivated through connection, then our place in the family of things is a beautiful way to describe what joy is, the wellspring that connects all life as one family. I find comfort in that idea of our shared connection. It affirms our you value of the belief in the interconnected web of life. But I'll be honest, it also frustrates me sometimes because the world we live in, that we humans have created, is one where we constantly cut that connection. I cannot stand here and wax poetic about joy and unintentionally imply that it magically sets aright all the world's wrongs, or unintentionally say that the harms we humans do doesn't matter in the face of joy. The world is hurting. I don't need to tell you that. I don't need to tell you that our political times are fraught and perilous. I don't need to tell you that too many people in our city, in our country, in our world are struggling in the vice grip of poverty and injustice. I don't need to tell you how white supremacist culture and capitalist systems devalue and destroy lives on a daily basis. You know these things. You know, too, how crushing is the weight of grief, both personal and private. We, each of us, carry so much pain and loss, face so many hardships beyond these walls, that speaking of joy seems almost pointless. Almost. For while joy does not erase our sorrow or negate injustice, joy does sustain us through them. My grandmother has been dead for 6 years, and the grief of her loss still throbs and stabs with pain. I will carry that grief with me always, but I also carry the memory of her hand in mine, and the joy of that is not lessened one bit by her passing. And in fact, I have found that the more joy I take in remembering her, the easier the grief is to bear. We have all suffered such personal losses, and I hope, many of you have found, as I have, that joy sustains you through the hardest moments. And whether the struggles we face are sharp pangs of loss or the burdens of a hard life, joy can be there for us. In her seminal theological study on evil, Out of the Depths, Brazilian ecofeminist theologian Ivone Guevara shares the story of Carolina Maria de Jesus, an Afro-Brazilian woman who lived in the slums of Sao Paulo and who succeeded for years in keeping a journal of her daily activities, despite the abject poverty in which she and her children lived. Guevara says that De Jesus' journal, which was eventually published in Brazil and elsewhere, is a witness to her search for happiness, her striving to connect with joy. In one passage of the journal, De Jesus writes, "I got out of bed at 4 a.m. to write. I opened the door and gazed at the starry sky." The first time I read that passage, I was immediately reminded of a quote by Oscar Wilde. He said, We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And if anyone could be said to be literally in a gutter, it would be a woman like De Jesus, a black woman, a second-class citizen in her own country, living in some of the worst conditions on the planet today, collecting trash and scraps of paper on the street to earn money to feed herself and her children. And yet, incredibly, she made time not only to experience joy, but to record it. And joy was not about her material conditions, nor, more importantly, was it about a hope for an afterlife. Rather, joy was about the precious moments she lived each day, despite the slums and the gutter around her. Joy did not and does not make the gutter disappear, but the gutter does not make the stars shine any less bright. Sojourner Truth once said in one of her many speeches, "Life is a hard battle anyway. If we laugh and sing a little as we fight the good fight of freedom, it makes it all go easier. I will not let my life's light be determined by the darkness around me." Sojourner Truth's words remind me of a verse from another song from my childhood, an American folk gospel song from the early 20th century called "Keep Your Hand on the Plow." While the song was written long after Sojourner's passing, the verse in question tells a story from the New Testament, a story I'm sure Sojourner would have been familiar with. The story is about the Apostle Paul traveling with another disciple, Silas, trying to connect with other followers of Jesus before Christianity even existed. They were scattered people envisioning a new world, and their beliefs were considered dangerous and illegal by authorities. Which was why, when Paul and Silas arrived at a Greek town, they were immediately arrested, flogged, and thrown into a jail cell where they were not expected to escape. But there in the dark, beaten and bloody, surrounded by hostile strangers, they did not despair. Instead, they began to sing. The song about them goes like this. Paul and Silas were thrown in jail. They had no one to go their bail. Keep your hand on the plow and hold on. Paul and Silas, they sang and shout. The door flew open and they walked out. Keep your hand on the plow and hold on. Paul and Silas sang and shout. I think of their story, as I think of most biblical stories, as a metaphor. A metaphor in this case of how joy can be the key to unlocking our freedom, literal and figurative. Their joy was not diminished by the unjust conditions they were in. Their joy transcended their environment and was deeply rooted in their connection to each other and to their belief in the work they were called to do. Certainly enslaved African Americans used biblical metaphors in their songs to inspire their hope for freedom. And Sojourner Truth and every slave and former slave like her knew far more about the world's darkness than I ever will. But if Sojourner could take inspiration from the story of Paul and Silas and advocate for singing, for joy in her life, then surely I can take inspiration from her. Surely singing, tapping into that joy down in our hearts, is an act of defiance, of resistance against the world's injustice. Carolina Maria de Jesus took time to look at the stars and write about it. Sojourner Truth took time to sing and laugh. And even Emma Goldman, who was a radical anarchist revolutionary, once famously said, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." The work we are called to do, to revolutionize the world, called by our talents and the world's needs, is exhausting. It's hard. And if we are people of color, it is even harder. And if we are people of conscience, it is nearly unbearable. But there is joy to be found in the work, and there is joy to tap into to help us do the work. And I am not talking here about joy as false positivity that asks us to look away and pretend everything is fine while the world burns down around us. No, I am talking about joy as a force that compels us to pick up a bucket and sing while we work with others to put the fire out. More than 20 years ago, I volunteered as a clinic escort just down the street, actually, to help protect people's reproductive rights. On Saturday mornings, early, I would take the bus to the corner of Farwell and Humboldt, don a vest, and with other volunteers, serve as a human shield between patients and anti-choice protesters. I was usually very tired from working a waitressing shift late the night before, and I was often scared because the protesters were usually loud and did not respect the space they were supposed to. But I clearly remember the calm I felt, looking in patients' eyes and telling them my name and assuring them I would walk with them. I remember going to Beans and Barley with other volunteers at the ends of our morning and sharing stories about what led us to be there. I felt joy when connecting to those patients, and joy also when laughing over lunch with others. The joy I felt was not the same overflowing as I felt in the trees of my childhood or the giddy happiness of my wedding day. The joy was a quieter pool of joy, like I found when holding my grandmother's hand. The joy of connection and purpose. And that joy of connection to and respite with others is essential to any work we do. Because, as Madison activist and poet Ali Muldrow wrote in her poem, The Truth About Saving the World, the revolution doesn't need your stress or your overworked, exhausted. I think sometimes we've turned busyness and overwork into a religion, and it is all too easy to be overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the work that needs to be done. And while the work needs to be done, no matter how we feel, we are foolish and do ourselves a disservice if we think that how we feel doesn't matter. Because the point is, if we aren't making room for singing and dancing and stargazing and resting in laughter with friends, if we aren't making room for music and joy, then what are we making room for? In the words of Trent Gilliss, I'd ask us to notice joy, nourish joy, consciously take advantage of your opportunities to experience joy. Because joy, known over a long period of time, takes you beyond yourself, deepening and expanding your mind beyond the boundaries of your disconnections. The world has enough disconnections. We have enough pain and darkness. The world needs more singing and dancing. So let's practice looking mindfully and being present. Let us remember to rest when we are tired and to laugh as often as we can. Climb a tree, read a book, hold a loved one's hand, do whatever you can to keep tapping into that well of joy that connects us all to each other. So that when we are asked, if I asked you, the revolution is only fueled by your every joy, would you believe me? We can answer yes. And when we are asked, do you think you deserve joy? We can answer yes. And when someone asks us, where is your joy? We can answer, down in our hearts to stay.